We mean to cancel the world you civilized people made. We will simply erase history from the time that machinery and weapons threatened more than they offered. And when you die, the last living reminder of hell will be gone.
Kind of takes the fun out of being alive, doesn't it?
I see dead people. Dead people.
There will be no order, only chaos.
Kind of takes the fun out of being alive, doesn't it?
Only chaos.
One pin makes you larger, and one pin makes you small, and the ones that mother gives you don't do anything at all. Go ask Alice when she's 2 feet small.
Down the rabbit hole we went, my beloved truth seekers. Down we were cast into the world of forms, like Alice or Sophia or the Enoia, the first thought of God when he became aware of existence. Plunging into a realm of chaos and piercing desperation. But once again, once a week, once in an eternity, we find ourselves catching a holy wormhole, a path of heavenly starlight, and we rise into the virtual Alexandria, the boundary between madness and selling out, heaven and hell, and truth and reality.
Anyone who isn't dead or from another plane of existence would do well to cover their ears right about now.
Welcome to Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis, a district of that virtual Alexandria, the cyber city of ultimate euphoria. Welcome to that dream of you. Welcome to be with those friends you have been looking for all of your life. Divided we stand, united we rise. And somewhere close to Saturday, November 3rd, 2007, just beyond the arc of the autumn equinox, you encounter Abraxas, your host of hosts, your humble Mad Hatter, and we dream together of that farthest shore, that end to the seas of fate beyond the gnashing rocks of orthodoxy.
Oh, dear Lord Jesus, this ain't happening, man. This can't be happening, man. This isn't happening.
We are the Gnostics, the veterans of 1,000 psychic wars. We write our own gospels and live our own myths. Like Carl Jung once said, dreams are personal myths. Myths are public dreams. And now it's time that those public dreams become manifest in this revolution in the name of Hypatia, the last librarian of the old material city of Alexandria, and the symbol for true free thinking. We are tired of the old macho gods and their infernal penises, their solar smiles and their burning lies. We are tired of the old religion that taught us to feel good but told us to feel bad. Like Joseph Campbell said, religion is myth misunderstood. And like Oscar Wilde said, Christ, save me from the Christians. We are also tired of historical misunderstandings. We are tired of the absence of the divine feminine that will restore the sanity to the testosterone gods and lead them back to the source of the all, the ultimate consciousness.
I tell my kids, only God can make a life.
We're tired, oh so bloody tired, but we've only just begun fighting with the armor of honesty and sword of altruistic truth. But what else is the Gnostic supposed to fight with? After all, the Gnostics have always been pacifists. We never hurt anyone, and for that we were hunted down throughout history like drunk southern belles. They sent us to the pyres, the Inquisition chambers, the graves of the saints, the distant and desolate lands away from civilization. They chased us out of the churches and synagogues, wrote slanderous yarns against us, burnt our works and made our heroes into demons. We never hurt anyone. We just wanted to understand, as St. Paul wrote, the mind of Christ. We wanted to touch the face of God and nurture our inner deific compassion. We wanted to participate in the wedding of Sophia and the Christos, watch the children of light play in the fields of imagination. We never hurt anyone.
Choose your next words carefully, Leonidas. They may be your last as king.
And one of the examples of the Gnostics being paddled like freshmen on the last day of school, perhaps the most famous one because of the Da Vinci Code, are the medieval Cathars. Such was their threat to orthodoxy back then that it not only spurned the first crusade against Christians, the first genocide of Catholics on Catholics, but it created the dreaded Inquisition. As bloody as was their purging, so is their mystery that has yielded many legends, including that they and the Templars were in cahoots, hiding the infamous Holy Grail.
You always got to follow the truth, even if it brings the whole damn thing crashing down around you.
I won't go into any more detail on the Cathars, or pure ones. This may bring tears of joy to your cloudy eyes, but you can access our first show on the most successful heresy of the Middle Ages on Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis number 14, with Judith Mann, author of Trail of Gnosis. Judith focuses on the more mystical side of the Cathars, including the possibility that they delved in crystal manipulation and other esoteric praxis. Today we lean a bit more on the historical, political, and dark humor side of the Cathar saga. Our guest does a praiseworthy task with his angle, and this is Sean Martin, author of The Cathars, The Gnostics, and several other books. Not only is Sean an accomplished scholar, he is also a filmmaker, novelist, and all-around esoteric extraordinaire.
Oh yeah, this just keeps getting better and better.
For more information, click the link I left on my homepage, for his profile is one of those blogs that has so many numbers and letters, if you know what I mean. Or Google Sean Martin and Gnostics if you are downloading the show in the distant future. After the show, I enjoin that anyone interested in a royal yet brief meta-history of the Cathars purchase Sean's book, The Cathars. Historically, it is a delirious story of villains and heroes, a comedy of eras of bureaucratic proportions, the end of innocence of a region in the world where Gnostics, Jews, women, and other minorities were deemed as equals, and so much more. The story of the Cathars is a classic account of what happens when the hounds of war are let loose by the cowardly politicians of the day, something we know a lot about in this age of computer warfare.
For the record, I don't like the way this turned out any more than you do. But this is the world we live in, and justice does not always prevail. It's not the Wild West where you can clean up the streets with a gun.
And in a scholarly manner, Sean is plenary in his research of the Cathars, including their theology, rituals, cryptic origins, and the possibility of their secret treasures that have captivated so many legend mongers and fiction writers. All of this and more put in a congenial book you can finish in a day or two.
Thanks. I was running short on platitudes. You can leave now.
Yes, we are the Gnostics. We never hurt anyone. Neither did the Cathars. And Jehovah cannot stand pacifists because it reminds him of the blood he has spilled in the past. Why repent and return to his mother, Holy Sophia, when it's easier to erase all that reminds him of his guilt off the face of history and even fiction? We all tend to do that in our lives, with friends, family, lovers, and co-workers we've wronged. Let's sweep the pain we cause under the rug before we realize that the hurt we give only hurts us as well. Let's be the demiurge and hunt down the Cathars of our lives who never really were a threat to our fulfillment. And so it goes, and so it goes.
Keep your friends close, but your enemies closer.
The only problem is, as the book says, is that we may be through with the past, but the past is not through with us. And we have just begun revealing the past to the world that maligned us, so that perhaps it may learn to leave us alone in the future. We never hurt anyone. This is Sean Martin, author of The Cathars, ahead on this dark odyssey. This is the Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis interview. Today we have Sean Martin, author of several books, including The Cathars and the Gnostics, which we'll be talking about today. How are you doing today, Sean?
Hi, Miguel. I'm very well, thanks, and happy to be on the show.
Oh, well, thank you very much for joining. I truly appreciate it. Okay, well, why don't we get started? I noticed both of your books deal with the important issue of dualism. Could you tell us what dualism is and what are its origins?
Yeah, dualism is basically the belief that instead of just having one all-powerful God, you've actually got two. In the sort of Judeo-Christian take on things, that's basically God and the devil. In other words, the dualists believe that the devil is as powerful as God, and it's life is a constant struggle between good and evil, which is kind of the, that sounds like something out of a fantasy movie, but that's essentially what fantasy Hollywood blockbusters do. Is kind of, it's a very filtered down version of this old dualist idea that evil is as strong as good, which I think that comes out in Lord of the Rings, for instance. But yeah, its origins are quite obscure. As far as we know, the earliest, dualism could be older than recorded history, but the earliest recorded dualist faith is Zoroastrianism, and Zoroastra, or Zarathustra, as he's sometimes known, is a man of uncertain dates himself. We think he may have lived around the year maybe 1200 BC, but that's give or take a couple of centuries. So, but Zoroastrianism is probably the world's oldest revealed religion, and the role of evil, the evil principle in Zoroastrianism, it originally started out as the evil principle not being as strong as the good. Then it underwent changes over time, and eventually the evil principle in Zoroastrianism became as powerful as the good, especially in an offshoot called Zurvanism. So that's from there that Zoroastrianism influenced all sorts of religions. Most of the main Western ones certainly. It's influenced Judaism and Christianity quite profoundly. And it then later flourished with the Gnostics, who seem to have been active around the time of Christ up until the 4th century of the Common Era, and then sort of went underground, and then the trail goes very cold, and then it re-emerges in the High Middle Ages with the Bogomils and the Cathars, and then kind of goes underground again. So it's it's an interesting tradition. It's a long tradition, and it's one that does intermittently kind of just reappear into historical visibility, but its origins are fairly murky.
And as far as we can tell, were the Cathars true dualists? Did they really see Satan and God as equal, coexistent, or was God going to win in the end?
Well, in the sort of original Zoroastrian version of events, God will win at the end of time. But there are different types of dualism. Has to be said. The Cathars, when they first emerged into the history books in the 1140s in Germany, in the Rhineland, they seem to have been what's called mitigated dualist or moderate dualists. And that means that if you're a moderate dualist, it's a bit like the original Zoroastrian idea that although the power of evil and the devil or Satan or whatever you want to call him is as strong as God, eventually God will, or good will triumph. But we know that in the 1160s or 70s, the Cathars became absolute dualists. They were converted by a Bogomil priest who came over from probably Constantinople, Istanbul in modern parlance. There was a big Cathar convention in the south of France, which, well, it's what is today the south of France, but then was the independent kingdom of Languedoc. And this guy came over, and there was a big meeting, a big Cathar convention, and he seems to have persuaded them all to become absolute dualists. So, and the absolutes believe that the God and the devil are completely equal, and there's no guarantee that there'll be a happy ending, really. Mind you, it has to be said that a lot of these guys, the absolute dualists, including a lot of Cathars, believed in reincarnation and the idea that time is cyclical. So, if the devil wins this time, maybe God will win next time, so history could repeat itself, which is quite an Eastern idea. It reminds me of, in Hinduism, you have the ideas of the great yugas, the great ages. We're currently in the Kali Yuga, which is, the age of darkness and violence and oppression. So that's kind of a brief summary of dualism in regards to the Cathars. I think the Gnostics of the classical era from the time of Christ up until whenever they kind of fall off the map, really, in about the 4th century. They were probably moderate dualists. They often talk about all of the very colourful and detailed Gnostic creation myths. All talk about the active role of what they called Ialdabaoth, who was basically the same as the God of the Old Testament. They didn't really have, this is the classical Gnostics, didn't really have a devil or an evil principle in the shape of the devil of medieval Gnosticism, the Gnosticism of the Cathars and the Bogomils. The Gnostics of classical antiquity basically said, well, the God of the Old Testament is, as famously says, I am a jealous God, and spends much of the Old Testament giving the Israelites a really hard time. So it's sort of their take on it was, with a God like that, we don't need a devil.
Right.
So, and the God of the Old Testament, as I say, the Gnostic name was Ialdabaoth, which has it's translated as in various ways. Sometimes it means childish God or selfish God. They said, well, this God claims to have created the world, but he didn't get it right because, evil exists and war and hunger and famine and so on. So their take on it was this God thinks he knows what he's doing, but he doesn't. There's actually a higher God above him. So, and obviously I know your website's called The God Above God. So,
right.
It's that kind of idea that the God who's overseeing the material world is, not the highest authority. There's somebody else higher up the food chain, as it were. And I think this is sort of reflected in mainstream Christianity to some extent, where the devil is known as the Lord of this world. And I think that's a reflection of the old Gnostic idea that the deity who was supposed to have created this world is actually not the main man, as it were. And he just thinks he's in charge, but he's not.
You mentioned the Cathar, their origins were in the Rhineland, or do we really truly know where they came from?
Well, the Rhineland Cathars, these were the first Cathars to emerge onto the pages of the history books, and I think they got found out in about the year 1143 or 44. And apparently they blew their cover by having an argument about some point of doctrine, and somebody tipped off the local bishop, and they all got hauled up before the Bishop of Cologne, I think, and the bishop managed to persuade them all to come back to the church. A couple of them didn't and got burnt at the stake, but before they got burnt, they said that their church was a really old tradition that dated back to the time of Jesus and the disciples. And there's actually no way of proving that, although there's no way of disproving it either. What we do know, or what we can kind of piece together, is that the Cathars were basically the Western version of the Bogomils, and the Bogomil faith flourished in the Balkans, starting in about the year maybe 930 or 940. Certainly, in other words, the second quarter of the 10th century. And it was said to have been founded by a priest called Bogomil, whose name we think was an alias or pseudonym, meaning beloved of God, or words to that effect. And the Bogomils were pretty extreme guys. The only scripture they used was the Lord's Prayer, and they were violently opposed to the ruling church in the Balkans at the time. So they were kind of revolutionaries. They didn't want the priests to go about in fine clothes. The Bogomils were firmly on the side of the peasantry who were getting a bum deal from the church. So, and what we think happened is that the Bogomils came over in waves, or maybe small groups, to start proselytizing Bogomilism. And the interesting thing is, though, with the Bogomils, none of them ever got caught, at least in the West. They did in the East, in the Byzantine Empire. We know of one guy, Basil, the Patriarch, I think, called Basil the Physician. I think that's his right name, Basil the Physician, who got caught and was interrogated and questioned by the emperor. And this was around the year 1100. And quite unusually got burned at the stake. They didn't really go in for burning at the stake very much over there at that time. That was very much a Western thing. But most of not most, all of the Bogomil missionaries who came to the West managed to, it was one of the best undercover jobs of all time, because they kind of came in and started converting people, then disappeared. They almost like phantoms, which is one of the things that I find quite interesting about them, is they managed to slip in under the radar and start this new religion off. And it only came to the attention of the church in the West, as I say, in about 1143 or 44 in the Rhineland. And by that time it was quite prevalent, because then these guys who are calling themselves Cathars started to appear all over the place, in kind of Holland and the Low Countries. They made it to England as well, during the reign of Henry II. What's slightly confusing is they were all known under different names according to which area they were in. There's one name, for instance, they were known by as Texerant, which I think was particular to the Netherlands. And nobody knows what Texerant really means. They think it's something to do with weaving. And weaving was a profession that was often associated with the Cathars for some reason. And then in England, they were known as the publicans, which didn't mean they were running, bars,
right.
Which is what the word means now. But I'm not sure what publican meant in the 12th century. I think it was maybe that it was probably a corruption of a continental word. And then they became known as Cathars, largely in Germany and the south of France. And there's differences of opinion as to what it means. Some people say it's derived from the Greek katharoi, which means pure one. And interestingly enough, at the Council of Nicaea in 325, which was really where the official Western Church got its act together and started to draw up things like the Nicene Creed and try and decide what they actually believed in. One of the things on the agenda to discuss during the council was what to do with the group called the Cathars, or the Catharoi, who were quite extreme ascetics. And it'd be nice to think there was a link between the 4th century Cathars and the 12th or 13th century Cathars, but it's really difficult to prove. It's although the medieval Cathars would say there was a link, no historian has yet managed to uncover a link, so it's really, really conjectural. So the other etymology of Cathar is that it means somebody who kisses a cat's bottom, which is what devil worshippers and all sorts of evil people, including heretics like the Cathars, were supposed to have done. The medieval church was really good at demonizing its enemies. Obviously they said a lot of similar things about the Jews, that they were, eating Christian children. And this was completely unfounded. And also in the case of the Cathars, they weren't going around, kissing cats' rear ends or anything. It's just stuff they were making up for, the purposes of propaganda. So, but anyway, the name stuck, so they were called Cathars. And, as I say, to this day, we're still not entirely sure which one is the right derivation. But, in terms of what the church saw the deadliest of heresies. So, as far as medieval churchmen were concerned, these guys probably really were going around doing things to cats, and all sorts of satanic ways. But on the other hand, the Cathar priesthood, who were called the Perfect, who were both men and women, really were very pure people. They were quite, noticeably good in a kind of, with a capital G. So the idea that they were the pure ones also, that works as well. They were pure in that sense. They were, abstaining from all of the vices that the rest of us mere mortals get up to.
What are some of the other theological beliefs that separated the Cathars from mainstream Catholicism? Essentially,
I've got a list here. It's in no particular order, but some of the main defining differences between the Cathars and the Church were that the Cathars rejected pretty much the whole of the Old Testament, and they regarded the God of the Old Testament as not the creator God. To them, he was Ialdabaoth, or the childish God. It was basically synonymous with the devil. What became the devil, because the idea of the devil underwent kind of a lot of philosophical changes. So, which is, that's really interesting in itself. The idea how evil became personified as the Old Testament, as more of the Old Testament came to be written. People changed their ideas about what evil was. So anyway, the idea that the Cathars believe this world is created by either an evil or, at the very least, incompetent deity who's not the real God. Obviously, the mainstream church would say that the creator God and the true God are one and the same, who's also the God of the Old Testament. And the Cathars also believe that because of that, creation itself, material things, were evil. Having said that, they saw the necessity of earning a living. You might be trapped in an evil creation, but you've got to pay the rent. So they were fairly practical people, and they got involved with lots of artisanal professions like weaving, which is one thing they became particularly associated with. They also worked as carpenters, for instance, or blacksmiths. So they were, they felt like they were in the world, but not of it, as the saying goes. They also didn't venerate the cross. To them, the cross was the instrument of Christ's torture and death. And obviously in the mainstream church at the time, and also in the Orthodox Church and the later Protestant churches, the cross is venerated as the emblem of Christ's suffering and sacrifice. But the Cathars didn't go for that sacrificial thing at all. To them, the cross was the instrument of Christ's death and suffering, and his role in coming to the world was not to be a sacrificial lamb, but to actually bring knowledge that will save us all. They also built no churches. They often held their services in people's homes, usually, but they were sometimes also known to have held services in barns or fields or woods or by rivers. So I think that's really beautiful, actually. Just brings the sort of spiritual life into the everyday in a really tangible way, especially if you are holding a service or giving a sermon in somebody's place of work or where they live, rather than in a church.
Were they vegetarian, Sean?
Yes, kind of. Basically, you've got the two main ranks of Cathars were the normal believers, and then the perfect, who were the priesthood. And once you became a perfect, you weren't allowed to eat meat, but you could eat fish. So they were fish-eating vegetarians, or rather, the perfect were fish-eating vegetarians, and the normal rank and file of Cathars, what they called the believers or the listeners, basically could eat meat or eat anything they wanted, really. It was only at that point when they decided they really wanted to commit to the faith, that's when they underwent the ceremony known as the consolamentum, which means the consoling. And once you'd been consoled, you couldn't eat meat again, although, as I say, you could eat fish. And if you did accidentally eat meat, somebody accidentally slipped a steak in under the radar, as it were, that meant you were no longer a perfect, and you had to be reconsoled. So you had to start from scratch. So in that respect, they were quite, they were pretty strict and extreme. You couldn't make a mistake once you were perfect. And a lot of them seem to have stuck it out, actually, from what we know, because even when they eventually began to clash with the mainstream church, a lot of the preachers who were trying to spread the message of the church realized that these guys were actually winning the hearts and minds of people because they were, conspicuously holy. Once the perfect became the perfect, once they'd been consoled, a lot of them didn't slip up. So, which I think, to our 21st century minds is quite impressive, actually. But some of them did accidentally eat meat or have sex. Then they were no longer, they were stripped of their rank and they had to start again. So,
and I hear that the sort of scripture that you say they didn't use the Old Testament, but for the New Testament, didn't they pretty much only use the Gospel of John?
Yes, they had a particular fondness for the Gospel of John. Nobody really knows why. I think the Bogomils revered the Gospel of John as well, and sometimes at a push they could be persuaded to, read the other Gospels. But when a Cathar was being consoled, for instance, it was the Gospel of John that was placed on your head. They had a kind of ritual where, part of the ritual meant you had to have the Gospel of John laid on your head, while the perfect who was consoling you recited certain verses. And if they couldn't find the Gospel of John, they would actually put a New Testament on your head instead. But where this veneration for John comes from is a bit of a mystery. It's one of those things related to the kind of esoteric side of Christianity that we don't really have any answers for. Obviously, the Gospel of John is quite different to the other three canonical Gospels, and again, that's a lot of people have wondered why that was. But yeah, I don't know myself. But it's interesting.
And what about the accusations that they performed like ritualistic suicide or helped each other suicide once somebody was enlightened enough to leave this world? Is there any basis for that?
Yes, there is actually. The rite was called the Endura, which I guess means the enduring, or the words to that effect. This seems to have been a ritual that Cathars from the 12th century had, but it's usually associated with what's called the OTA revival, which happened in the early years of the 14th century. And it was named after a guy called Pierre Otier, who was a guy from the south of what we now call France. And he kind of got the faith in big time in the 1290s. And from about 1299 to about 1310 is the era of the Otier revival. There was Pierre Otier, his brother, and a couple of converts, including a couple of women. The Cathars had women priests. And because of the nature of the time they were in, this is a good 55 or so years after the fall of Montségur, which was the big Cathar citadel in the Pyrenees, which fell in 1244. So after that, Catharism goes underground in the south of France. So by the time Pierre Otier comes along and tries to do a one-man revival, and does a pretty good job, I must admit, those years of, they're quite amazing. But it did mean that Catharism was totally underground by that time. So what that would mean is if somebody was consoled, underwent the consolamentum, it was kind of often became in that era a deathbed rite. So what would happen is in order to ensure they went to their soul was saved, they would undergo this rite called the Endura, which basically meant after you were consoled, you were allowed to only consume water. So the one way of, if somebody in your family you thought was a Cathar had been consoled, and you wanted to make sure they went to the, Catholic heaven, not the Cathar heaven, as it were, you kind of try and feed them meat while they're on their deathbed, or make them drink wine. I mean, the Cathars weren't totally against wine, but certainly in this sort of environment, when somebody was consoled on their deathbed, they really shouldn't have had wine. So, and in some cases, so in other words, they were sort of hastening their own end if they were really, on death's door. Just drinking water would, not taking any other nourishment would bring about, the final journey. But we do know of one or two cases where people took the Endura. They got consoled, and then they took the Endura, and they don't seem to have been particularly ill.
Wow.
So these were people who were basically intent on dying, by the sound of it. And this is kind of it's one of those cases where somebody's just hell bent, as it were, for pardon the expression, on seeing something through. So and we do know that one woman in the time of Pierre Otier and his gang, in other words, the early 14th century, was consoled and then lived on nothing but water, and apparently she took about 7 weeks to die. So in that's a really extreme case, and not many of those cases have been have come down to us, but we do know about that woman. So that was obviously a kind of, she wanted to die, but as a whole, they weren't particularly suicidal or anything. It was just in the context of the Otier era, with the once the Inquisition was founded to root out the Cathars. So the Cathars by that time, by say 1300, 1310, were hunted people, and the entire faith was going on underground. So things like the Endura became a kind of practical necessity, really.
Is there any evidence of the legendary surrounding the Cathars, like they possessed the Holy Grail and were affiliated with the Knights Templar? Any evidence of that?
Yes and no, basically. The Templars themselves were associated with the Grail, and the Templars definitely had Cathars in their ranks. So, the Templars, the Cathars, and the Grail are kind of, they're three overlapping areas. What we know about the Templars, for instance, I'll take it one step at a time to try and keep it simple, because there are no easy kind of explanations as to all this. We know that the Templars were particularly strong in the Languedoc. One of their great grandmasters from the 12th century, who was the Grand Master in the 1150s, I think, was a guy called Bertrand de Blanquefort, and he was from a Cathar family. And so this is really early Catharism, well before any kind of military moves had been made against them. And the Templars were really strong in the Languedoc. And when the crusade against the Cathars started in 1209, which is called the Albigensian Crusade. I'm sure that's something we'll come to discuss. When that started, the Templars refused to participate because, as far as they were concerned, they didn't want to go to war against what they saw as fellow Christians. And if you were a Cathar being persecuted or were on the run, you could join the Templars and you'd be safe, because the Templars were answerable only to the Pope. And because of the Templars had this Cathar connection going back to the 1150s, they seem to have been sympathetic to the Cathars. That could have been, I think, for a couple of reasons. They had a lot of support in the Languedoc, and to turn against the Cathars during the Albigensian Crusade era in the early decades of the 13th century would have been politically really difficult for them, because a lot of the Templars' wealth in terms of land holdings and castles and so on was in that area. So if they started to go against their supporters, the nobility of the Languedoc, that would have been difficult for them. And the Templars were always short of manpower because of the main crusades in what we now call the Middle East, but what the Templars called the Outremer, the land beyond the sea. Obviously, knights were, the death toll was pretty high. So, we are talking about medieval warfare, which is pretty bloody, and a lot of carnage and gore involved. Right. So the Templars were always looking for new recruits, so they would even accept, ex-convicts, and they weren't particularly fussy, which probably added something to the Templars' reputation for being, necromancers and being evil. But I think, I think there was just a long tradition of the Templars being good friends with Cathar nobility. So that's where I think the Templar-Cathar link comes from. That they were basically friends. They were all together in the south of France and had decades worth of friendships and alliances going back to the 1150s, if not earlier than that. So that kind of puts the Cathars, in bed, as it were, with the Templars. They were kind of allies, largely by dint of being together in the same area. The Grail stuff is really interesting. I mean, the Grail, all of the Grail stories start to get written towards the end of the 12th century. And we don't really know where they came from. It's traditionally said it's Chrétien de Troyes who, obviously he wrote the first one, that's a fact, or the earliest surviving one. Whether or not there's a Templar connection with Chrétien, I don't know, but Chrétien came from Troy, hence being known as Chrétien de Troyes, Chrétien of Troy. The Templars were actually from the Troy area. So it could be that Chrétien was talking to the Templars, and maybe it's, according to one version of the story, the Templars found something under the Temple Mount, and knowledge, kind of rumours filtered back to Europe. This is all sort of speculative history, but it's there's no way of disproving it. The Templars do seem to have been excavating under the Temple Mount, but again, it's a kind of really contentious issue amongst modern archaeologists, and some of the Templar tunnels under the Temple Mount these days, they've been closed for about 40 years, so whether anybody will get back in there is, it's kind of dependent on the political situation in Israel and the Middle East. So anyway, I'm sort of going off the beaten track slightly. And it was known by about the early 13th century that the Cathars had treasure, and whether this was financial treasure or spiritual treasure or the Grail as well, we don't know. But these stories were definitely circulating at the time. They're not the invention of later writers. There's been a lot of romanticization of the Templars and the Cathars by 19th and 20th, and indeed, 21st century writers. And but I don't know. I think there's a case of there's no smoke without fire, and that the Cathars were certainly rich in terms of having rich benefactors. Not all of the nobility of the south, but certainly a lot of them were either Cathars themselves, or allowed Catharism to flourish in their lands, and that became one of the major causes of the Albigensian Crusade. Now, the interesting thing, this is one of those moments in history where you really, I personally start to wonder, is when the fortress of Montségur was being besieged in 1243 and 44, It finally fell on the 16th of March, 1244. What happened was there were about 200 Cathar perfect on this, incredibly inaccessible Pyrenean castle. And they had a number of mercenaries fighting for them. By this time, some of the Cathars had sort of decided non-violence just wasn't an option, and some of them kind of formed breakaway, commando units, almost like, like the sort of Cathar version of the Marines or something, and would indulge in a bit of violence here and there, killing the odd person, but that's the nearest they ever got to being, the church was much more violent towards them than they ever were, in the other direction against the church. So anyway, what happened, and this is one of these like Grail, sort of moment in history where the Grail almost becomes visible in history, is a fortnight before Montségur fell. I think they signed a truce on the 2nd of March, give or take a day, I forget. It was around the early March. And the deal was that the Cathars could continue doing their things in Montségur for 2 weeks, and then they would surrender on the 16th. And what actually happened was, and the offer they were given was that if they all renounced Catharism, they'd be allowed to live. Obviously, they would be questioned by the Inquisition. But if they didn't renounce Catharism, then they'd be burnt at the stake. So it was pretty clear cut as to what was going on. They were, the church was happy to accept these people back into the ranks as, repentant sinners. But what actually happened, which is really interesting, is all 200 or so perfect refused to convert back to mainstream Christianity. And a number of the people, the mercenaries, actually converted to Catharism, knowing that it was certain death.
Wow.
They converted about a week before. And that's a fascinating thing, because then, literally the night before the fortress fell, the so-called Cathar treasure was smuggled out. Apparently a couple of guys scaled down the cliff face in the middle of the night and were never seen again. So whether these guys converted, these mercenaries converted because they had seen the Grail or not, I don't know, but it kind of makes me wonder. Having said that, we do know for a fact that they definitely did convert to Catharism, and they definitely, as a result, went to the stake with the 200 or so perfect. So that's really intriguing. But I think, on the other hand, and we do know that something was definitely smuggled out of Montségur, never to be seen again. That's pretty much a fact. What it was, we don't know. I mean, some people think it's the Holy Grail. Other people think it was just a lot of gold and silver and precious rubies and stones and so on. But I don't know. I mean, I keep trying to keep my options open, really, because I think these stories are at the most potent when you you keep all your options open. And I've thought. I mean, I say in my book, The Cathars, that maybe one interpretation of this Cathar treasure is actually their simplicity. They were, it's a very simple faith that, as we've been talking about, they held their services in people's homes or in barns or fields or in the woods. So it was very, very simple faith. And I think that kind of emphasis on simplicity and goodness, and in the main they were non-violent. But there was a couple of incidents towards the end in France where they killed church delegates, but I think that was not the mind. They never endorsed violence. So maybe that was the real Cathar treasure. I don't know. It's something that seems to me to make sense in the way that history is often misinterpreted, and what starts out as a metaphor becomes a historical kind of concrete supposed fact. I mean, the Grail is a good example where some people think it's definitely has to be just a kind of a symbol of inner spiritual attainment. Some other people think it was a definite physical object, a cup or a stone. But so I think maybe the Cathar treasure, the Cathar Grail, if you like, was actually their simplicity and their devotion and their goodness.
Sean, how exactly did the crusade against them begin? What was the turning point?
The last straw was the murder of the papal legate to the south of France, a guy called Peter of Castelnau, or Pierre of Castelnau, who got killed in early 1208, January 1208. Nobody knows who killed him. He was apparently hacked down while waiting for a ferry to cross the river Rhone in the south of France. And the Pope, Innocent the Third, he believed that it was people sympathetic to the Count of Toulouse, Raymond VI, who was a famous Cathar sympathizer. That's never been proved. I mean, Raymond VI denied all knowledge, so it's possible this guy was killed by either somebody sympathetic to Raymond and the Cathars and wanted to kind of get this awful papal legate out of the way. I mean, this guy was really unpopular. I mean, everybody hated him. So it could have been a case of some local, guy thinking, well, let's get rid of this guy. And, it's not impossible that this guy was killed by papal agents, just kind of precipitate a war. They needed a really good excuse to start a military campaign. But, the jury's out, I think. We'll never know for sure. But the guy definitely got killed. And that's what triggered off what became known as the Albigensian Crusade. But actually, I mean, the whole problem had been boiling up for decades. I mean, as we're saying earlier, the first Cathars came to light in about 1143 in Germany. A couple of those guys, the ones who didn't recant, got burnt at the stake. And then there was a sort of a little bit of a military campaign against the Cathars in the south of France in the 1160s, I think. Or maybe I'm getting my dates wrong. It might be the late 1170s, actually. Or possibly even early 1180s. I haven't made a note. Anyway, there was definitely a campaign that didn't really do much because it was kind of one nobleman and some knights. They went down to the south of France and didn't really manage to either kill that many people or convert many people. So, yes, just looking at my in the back of my book here, it's 1181. There was a short-lived campaign against the Cathars in the area around Lavaux, led by Henry de Marcy. Anyway, shortly after that, in 1184, the Cathars and other heretical groups like the Waldensians were finally officially declared heretical. And then eventually, by the early 13th century, the church started sending representatives down to the south of France and to other places to try and win them over by debate. So we know that in the south of France they had a number of public debates between the years, I think it was around 1204 to 1207. And usually the church guys lost the debates. The Cathars kind of argued them out of court. And so then what happened was this guy called Dominic Guzman turns up and says to the Pope, look, there's no point sending in your priests if they're in kind of all this, regal finery, because the Cathar perfect are just walking around barefoot and kind of men and women of the people. So why don't we try that? So this guy does that, and he eventually becomes Saint Dominic. He goes around with his men, trying to preach to the people of the Languedoc in a kind of Cathar-like way. They walked everywhere. They were barefoot, and that seems to have had some success. But the Languedoc was still pretty much defiantly Cathar. And then, as I said, the papal legates got assassinated, and I imagine a lot of people probably thought, heaving a sigh of relief, this awful man was dead. Then the Pope decided this was the end of the line and called for a crusade. And it was the first crusade mounted against fellow Christians. And because of the various nobility and various kings he'd asked to join were all kind of busy doing their own, stuff. The campaign didn't get underway until the following year. We do actually have precise dates for the start of the Albigensian Crusade. As I say, Peter of Castle now, the papal legate, was bumped off on the 14th of January 1208. 10th of March, Innocent, the Pope, called for a crusade. It didn't actually get underway until the 18th of June 1209, when the Count of Toulouse, Raymond VI, was publicly flogged, and he was forced to apologise for shielding Cathars. And then a month later, on the 22nd of July, which is the feast of St. Mary Magdalene, the town of Béziers was sacked. And this is the first atrocity of the campaign. They surrounded the town, which held, at least 10,000 people. And the papal legate was asked by the military chiefs, who should we kill? And he then comes up with the notorious command, kill them all, God will know his own. So that's what they did. They basically killed the entire town. And there's got to be at least sort of 10,000 people in Béziers that day. Some people say as much as 20,000, but we know that probably around 10,000 people got killed in a day. Most of whom weren't Cathars, but they went in there and, basically carpet bombed the whole place.
Isn't that where they burned the church?
Yes.
They burned the church with all the people in it on Saint Mary Magdalene's feast day?
That's right, yes. Because obviously, the whole idea of, going into a church was sacrosanct, and was traditionally the place where you could always find safety and you would never be harmed in a church. But not this time. This was the first time when the sort of church broke its own rules and they burnt the church down with, full of people. And it kind of went from there. I mean, the first 2 or 3 years of the Albigensian Crusade were the most notorious. That's when they were, killing entire towns, on a regular basis. And then it kind of became more of a, protracted, intermittent thing with, the atrocities getting smaller. But they had lasted for 20 years altogether, and it was basically a church-sponsored crime against humanity. There's no two ways about it, really. It's even critics at the time who were normally pro-church were kind of saying, "Wow, this is horrendous," and they were trying to blame the violence on mercenaries, because all medieval armies had mercenaries. There was no such thing as a standing army, apart from the Templars. But it actually wasn't. That wasn't the case. The violence was actually authorized by the church, and pretty soon into the first campaign, just after Béziers, about a month later, Simon de Montfort became the leader of the crusade, and he sounds like a complete psychopath.
Yeah, I read his stuff. Horrible, man.
Yeah, dreadful. I mean, he obviously saw himself as a very pious Christian, and obviously we've got to remember that these people were living in an age of extreme piety, but even so, he was incredibly violent and sadistic, and he eventually got killed at the sack of Toulouse, the siege of Toulouse, rather, in 1218, where his head got destroyed by a stone fired from a catapult. And the story goes that the catapult was operated by women. And I've always thought that was like, a bit of poetic justice that,
Oh, I agree.
If every man deserved to have his head smashed in, it was him.
Right. And but what's funny is when you read, let's say, Dan Brown and other novels, romantic novels on the whole issue, and people believe that the genocide was one swell swoop, but the crusade was just a long campaign of small fights, peace treaties, a comedy of errors, and really a chaotic endeavor, wasn't it? Yeah, that's right. As I say, the first couple of years, from about 1209 to 1212, it was pretty full on. And then the Pope decided, he'd obviously heard stories about the brutality and the cruelty, which, even for medieval standards was terrible. And actually stopped the crusade in 1213. Unfortunately, he was persuaded to relaunch it about 5 months later. So then it carried on. Then Simon de Montfort dies after having made a lot of money out of it. There's shades of Iraq here. I think he made a lot of personal gain out of the war, right? Out of the crusade. And then that's where it starts to really fall apart, because his son kind of takes over, and his son's not really a military strategist, and he's far less cruel, and he kind of starts to lose all of the gains his father had made. Then kind of some of the main Cathar nobility start dying off. St. Dominic, well, he wasn't St. Dominic then, but he dies as well in the early 1220s. And then I think de Montfort's son kind of cedes all of his lands to the French king. And at that time, the Kingdom of France was around the area around Paris. So by about 1226, you've then got the French king involved in the whole thing, which then starts a new phase. And then by that time, the southern nobility who were fighting for the Cathars couldn't withstand yet another invasion, this time from the north. So the whole thing kind of peters out around 1229 with the what was called the Treaty of Paris. But yeah, you're right in saying that it was pretty intermittent. There were, but you'd have several years of offensives, then it would kind of tail off a bit, and then it would start up again. So it was, and even in, one of the tailing off periods was the mid 1220s, when the Cathars felt, sufficiently safe to hold another council. There was a major council in 1226, but unfortunately for them, that was the year the French king started to head south. So yeah, it was kind of intermittent, and it was generally a really 20 years that were just decimated the Languedoc. It was
regardless of its intermittent nature, it was a really, really terrible period.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the Cathars who got it. Like I said, it was Catholics and Jews who.
Yes, they were. Yeah, there was certainly instances of both Catholics and Jews being killed by the Crusaders as well. So they were just totally ruthless. It was such was their desire to root out the Cathars that they would just kill anybody.
The fall of Montségur was pretty much the end of the Cathars in southern France, or the end of the Crusade.
Well, the Crusade officially ended in 1229. Then about 2 years later, the Inquisition is formed to root out the Cathars, because although the Crusade had officially ended in 1229, there was still a lot of people were still Cathar. So that's when the Inquisition started, and they were sort of the first, secret police almost. And they mounted a huge campaign which lasted for decades to root out Cathars, and were, encouraging people to, inform on their neighbours and so on. It's, it's kind of the forerunner of, sort of the secret police in Eastern Europe in the 20th century. It's a Western invention. And these guys are pretty scary. And then what happened was the last major stronghold. There were a number of fortresses that were sympathetic to the Cathars, and Montségur was the last remaining major one, and that fell in 1244. And then after that, Catharism becomes much more low profile in the south of France. It wasn't actually the last Cathar castle to fall. There was a castle called Queribus, which fell in 1255. That's a bit of a mystery because we don't know much about it. It might have actually been fallen by negotiation, so all of the Cathars inside might have actually got away. I think that's, having read around the subject, that seems to have been what happened, because I think if there was a bloodbath, we would have heard about it. So I think the Queribus Cathars managed to escape. Where they went, we don't know. So then it becomes an underground thing. In the early 14th century, you have the OTA revival, and that's finally the last OTA perfect is burnt at the stake in 1321. But the Catharism is still going on in places like Italy, where the last Cathars were actually burnt at the stake in 1389. So the fall of Montségur in 1244 isn't really the end of it. It kind of does carry on, and also across a number of the Italian Cathars crossed the Adriatic into the former Yugoslavia, into places like Bosnia. And the Bosnian church is one of those big sort of historical riddles. We don't know whether they were actually a Cathar church or a Bogomil church. Obviously, Bogomils had passed through Bosnia on the way to preach in the West, so Bosnia was a kind of land of, I think it was called a land of many heresies by one churchman. And he was dead right. They were pretty much a heretical country. And when the Ottoman Turks invaded in the 1450s, it's thought that a lot of the Bogomils, or Cathars, whatever you call them, whatever you want to call them, converted to Islam, but we don't really know for sure. We know that the Cathars were active in Bosnia much later than anywhere else, as I say, well into the 1450s. And in fact, the last reported sighting of a Bogomil was 1867, so we just don't know. They could still be active today. I kind of hope they are.
Yeah. Somehow they survived. Somehow one or two.
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, it reminds me of a story by, I think, a British researcher. I forget who it was now. They were in the south of France maybe 10 or 20 years ago in the Languedoc, and they were researching Catharism and, all of the associated stories about Mary Magdalene and the Grail and so on, all the Rennes-le-Château type stuff. And they got talking to a local woman, and the Cathars came up in conversation, and the woman just says, I think she was quite an old lady, probably in her 60s, 70s, whatever, or even older, said, we are still Cathars, madame, but we don't talk about it. And that's all she would say. So in a way, I think the Cathars do still survive in the south of France today, in a kind of more in the sense of folklore or just tradition. It's something that's kind of in the air or in the blood. They're all sympathetic to the Cathars, and they always have been. So in a way, the story does come from the Middle Ages down to us today. So that there still are people out there who claim to be from Cathar families in that area.
Well, I think that should do it for today on the Cathars, Sean. Like to thank you very much for coming on Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis.
Thank you, Miguel. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I hope we can talk again.
Oh, yeah, we'll have you back on and talk about the Gnostics.
That'd be great.
All right, have a good day.
Okay, thank you. Cheers.